Welcome to the Twin Cities Business Show. Baseball's back. This week, we are talking Twins with Twin Cities business editor Adam Platt. Adam is going to take us under the hood of the team's finances, talk a little bit about the business of the Twins, where the league is headed, a potential looming strike, and more. Adam sat down with Tom Pohlad in our latest edition, which you can find online at tcbmag.com. Welcome to the Twin Cities Business Show. I'm Charlie Ryback. We have a very special guest today. We are here with Adam Platt, the editor of Twin Cities Business Magazine. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Charlie. Happy to be here.
All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Twins because in the latest issue of Twin Cities Business Magazine on newsstands now, we have a couple exciting features in here. One is a big piece on the Lutzen fire. One is a big piece on a program that is helping local women of color enter boards around the country. That's a great piece done by Liz Fetter, and a few other things. One is an article that Adam did based on a conversation with the new Twins owner, Tom Pohlad. So we're going to have Adam talk a little bit about that interview, a little bit about what Tom is doing, and then get into sort of the business of the Twins. You know, Adam has covered sports and sports business for a while, and is a big Twins fan, as am I, and is going to tell us a little bit about what he learned from Tom, and try to take people behind the scenes on where the business of the Twins is at. And there's a lot of consternation within the fan base right now about the current payroll situation. So to try to provide a little bit more context around that. If you are interested. First, Adam, I'm going to ask you on the record, how many games are the Twins going to win this year?
Oh, I actually made a bet with a friend of mine about this, former Hennepin County Commissioner Mike Opat.
Okay.
Mike always is more optimistic than me. I went with 73, I believe.
What did he say?
I think he said 82.
I'm gonna go with 80. I'm gonna go with 80. I think the pitching might actually be kind of good. And
Justin
80's,
Topa.
Yeah. Taj Bradley, it is currently mid-April. We've just won 3 games in a row against the Tigers, so I might be feeling more optimistic than I will be in a week.
Bias, do they call it?
But I don't know. I think hope springs eternal. It's what baseball's all about. So tell us a little bit more about your conversation with Tom. So you went down to Florida. You had a conversation with him. Tell us a little bit about how that went and kind of what you were able to learn from just that conversation, reporting out the story.
Yeah, well, I think, it's kind of difficult, I think, for the public to understand what's going on inside the Pohlad family and has been going on for decades and generations. Tom is in his 40s. He was a college student in 2001 when he wrote an op-ed when the Twins were supposedly being contracted, if you remember that era, which was 15 years after his grandfather bought the team. So there's a lot of water under the bridge with the Pohlads. Tom is the son of Bob, who's one of the 3 Pohlad brothers that people know best, I think, right now. And his brother Joe had been the family executive in charge of the team until this offseason. And I think in terms of the changes that happened there, it is worth kind of understanding what was sort of going on behind the scenes. Because, a year ago, we thought the team was for sale.
Right.
The family had decided to sell the team, and they decided to sell the team because the team had nearly $500 million in debt. Mm-hmm. And the debt service had become so oppressive that they weren't able to monetize the business. They weren't able to make a profit, and they were having to pay all this debt service, and they kept cutting payroll. At some point, it's a little hard to believe this, but at some point somebody said to them, well, you know what? Why don't you just bring in some minority investors to cover the debt, and you can still own the team? And what they said to the public was, we didn't realize we could do this. Okay, so they found some minority investors, and they decided to retain the team. And over the winter, very suddenly, once the deal closed that brought those investors in, it was announced that Joe was being replaced by Tom. And it appears to have been part of the package of bringing in the minority investors. I don't know that they insisted on it, but I think it was sort of like, let's try to make a clean start. Let's show the public that we're rethinking this thing and we're new minds and new energy. Joe was soft-spoken, very affable, but kind of quiet. Everybody thought he was going to be the president of the team one day. Tom is a little more hard-nosed. He appears he's friendly but serious. And according to people who know him, he's kind of wants to take the bull by the horns. He wants to be in charge. And that's kind of the main message I got from him was that he's going to run the team. He's not going to pick the players, but all the major business decisions are going to run through him for at least this season and for the foreseeable future until he feels like he has his handle on the business. What's so interesting is whatever day in December the press conference was called to introduce him, he basically had no interaction with the Twins prior to that Monday. He did not go to board meetings. He was not involved in the on the managing of the business, and so it was all new to him. And so he's had this whole, what do they call it, drinking from a fire hose
Mhm.
sort of experience. And so he's the business. The family is now running the business, as opposed to in the past where they designated that to other Dave St. Peter and other individuals.
Right, right, which is a very interesting shift. So, what do you feel like you were able to pick up? Fans I think are still trying to wrap their heads around what this all means. What did you feel like you picked up just spending time with him, being around him, and really seeing him in the spring training environment where he was really integrated with the team that you think you didn't know before you went down there?
Um, I think I think he's I think he recognizes that the team has a messaging problem.
Mhm.
That as much as anything, they've not communicated well with the fans, or they have left it to others to communicate with the fans, when in fact people really see the Pohlads as the operating owner of the team. When the team has a bad year, the cry from the fans is not about Dave St. Peter or Derek Falvey. It's about the Pohlads. And he seems to recognize that and wants to kind of start getting out in front of that. So he wants to be the guy that talks to the fans. And I think they're going to be a little more transparent about what they're doing and why. They're not going to try to finesse things quite as much. He's admitted they made some strategic errors with payroll and timing of stuff. I don't know that he is a radical break with the past. What I know he is looking at is trying to figure out what is the way for them to optimize the economics and winning. In other words, he said to me, we don't want to just get to the playoffs. We want to thrive in the playoffs, and we want to thrive in the playoffs consistently. And so if to do that, we need to have more down years to achieve up years. He didn't lay out a plan, but he's trying to understand really what is the secret sauce right now in baseball for a team with the kind of economics the Twins have to be in the playoffs more often and get beyond the first round.
Very interesting. Um, Okay, so let's go back in time a little bit and just take people through a little bit of the how the Twins' finances got here. So, the opening of Target Field was this big moment. They all of a sudden enter the top half in attendance. Revenue goes way up. There's obviously some money that had to be used to pay down the stadium debt, but largely the Twins start making money in a way that they never had, and payroll sort of tracked with that. They get to close to pretty close to league average for a bunch of years in there, and then COVID hits, and all of a sudden everything changes. So, how would you describe that moment financially for the team, and then some of what came next? But let's start with just the moment that COVID hits and what happened after that.
Okay, so if we think about 2020 and Major League Baseball, COVID basically hit in the middle of spring training. Major League Baseball shut down spring training and basically was dormant for a couple of months. Uh, they were trying to figure out how to resume or start the season safely. And what they ended up going to, and I think the season was a 2-month season that began around August 1st. And there were no fans in the stands. I think people remember they could like send their photo in and it would be attached to a piece of poster
Yep, there
board,
were all the cutouts. We
all the
should
cutouts.
we'll include a photo of that.
And so they played for 2 months in front of no fans. And then there were some playoffs, and the Twins went to the playoffs, but I think they were eliminated in the first round. They were favored, and I think the Astros
Right, the sweep
smacked
at home,
them
right?
right, the sweep at
It's
home.
tough.
And so that was a year with very little revenue. Major League Baseball teams still today derive the bulk of their revenue from the in-ballpark experience. Ticket sales, concession sales, merchandise sales, unlike most other professional sports. The NFL certainly not, the NBA certainly not. I don't even think hockey, but definitely not the NFL and the NBA. So they had virtually no revenue. Many major league teams, many pro sports teams furloughed almost their entire organizations during the dark months and then hired a limited number of people back during the 2 months the team was operating. The Twins did not do that. The Twins paid everybody. They didn't furlough anyone. Then in 2021, it was still a mixed bag. You know, the vaccines had been out, but the first half of the season was played with limited capacity in the ballpark. People were still reluctant. You know, many people were not comfortable being in large public venues.
Mhm.
Attendance was limited. And so you had a season with vastly kind of impaired revenues in 2021. 2022 was back to a normal season. But so in those 2 years, the Twins' revenues they probably were 300 to $500 million below normal, and the Pohlads borrowed so
Mhm.
they could pay salaries and just maintain their operations of the team.
So that's the origin of the team's debt, is
The
this
bulk
moment
of
during
it,
COVID. Yeah.
the bulk of it, as I understand it, I don't know that it's all of it, but it's the bulk of it.
Mhm.
Now, where they got the money, you know, a family as wealthy as the Pohlads with as many business properties as they have access to bank financing that you or I couldn't get in terms of interest rates. Major League Baseball also has a loan facility, as they call it, where teams can borrow from Major League Baseball at
Mhm.
below market interest rates. So that's where they borrowed the money. But Major League Baseball also has limits on the amount of debt teams can carry as a percentage of their value. And it sounded like the Twins were getting close to those limits. Um, the Twins are currently estimated to be worth about $1.7 billion. And so they were nearing about a third leverage on the team.
Right.
And so I'm guessing part of why the Pohlads acted when they did was they were starting to bump into that. And maybe they were still borrowing a little money, or maybe they were just simply unable to pay it off through team operations because the team has not had that many good seasons since they moved
Mhm.
into Target Field. Not attendance wise. I mean, it's been kind of a gradual slide. And then the winning seasons have been, I think, outnumbered by the losing seasons.
Right. Can you just explain to people how debt service works and why it is expensive to take out debt, and just how the mechanics of debt
Sure.
work in an organization like this?
Well, so, I mean, if you have a mortgage or a car loan, you know, we kind of understand how those things work. If the Twins, if they had a $500 million in debt, and let's say they were borrowing at 5% interest, which would probably be below market, but maybe realistic for this situation, you're borrowing, you're going to have $25 million in interest a year
Mhm.
to pay on that debt. And the Twins' profitability, from what estimates are, um, is right had historically been right around there, maybe a little above, a little less from season to season. So you're taking the amount of money that you would maybe pay a really good player, a star player, or three good to excellent players a year. You know, three $8 million pitchers
Right.
for debt service.
Yeah.
And so, and you know, the fans are like, so what? You're rich, you're billionaires. What's the problem? Well, some of it was the league covenants, but some of it was that the Twins, like many, the Pohlads, like many sports owners, want to operate the team sustainably. They don't expect to take wheelbarrows of cash out of it every day, but they don't want to lose enormous sums of money. And Tom Pohlad very overtly rejects the idea that most teams operate that way.
Mhm.
He insists that guys like Steve Cohen, the owner of the Mets, who is losing, you know, $200 million a year on the team, are real outliers, and that most owners operate like the Pohlads, and you have to kind of, at least to some extent, align the money coming in and the money coming out. It doesn't have to be, you know, perfect,
Yeah.
but it has to be somewhat close. And so for the Twins to spend another $100 million on payroll, which is probably what they would have to spend to be in the playoffs every year.
Hmm.
Um, that involves them losing about $100 million a year, and the Pohleds don't want to do that.
Yeah. So those owners are out there. There are people who are willing to lose money on the team, but according to
Right.
Tom, that those are more the outliers than people who are not.
And I think it may be specific to baseball because, as I understand the economics of the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, those leagues have negotiated contracts with their players and salary caps and things that really inhibit kind of wild overspending
Hmm.
and also require a certain base level of spending, but they inhibit the kind of crazy overspending. You can see the Wolves. The Wolves have been in this position the past couple seasons where they're over some of the league limits and they're being
Right.
penalized for being there. And so I think it is fairly specific to baseball. These teams that sort of spend kind of exuberantly.
Yeah. So there was another big factor that went into some of the losses that the team took, and this is the local TV revenue. So
Yes,
local TV revenue, in my research, looks to be about a quarter of the revenue that the teams pull in every year on average, somewhere in that neighborhood. Um, Talk a little bit about what happened with the local TV deal here and around the league, and how that led to other shortfalls.
sure. Well, and this is a real time phenomena that is still playing out.
Mhm.
Over the next 4 weeks, FanDuel Sports Network, which carries the Wolves and the Wild right now, this week,
Mhm.
is going to shut down. It's the regional sports network that served the Twin Cities region, and the economics of those businesses have gone south.
And that was previously Bally's, and that was before that was Fox Sports North for a
Fox,
long time. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And so the Twins were on Fox Sports North, Bally's, for a long time, couple of decades, I believe. There was a period when the Pohleds tried to start their own RSN called Victory Sports. Some of us may remember that. It didn't work because they couldn't get carriage on the cable networks. They didn't want to deal with that. And so they're like, no. So they went back to Fox and they'd been there for a long time. But cable cord cutting had really affected the regional sports network business
Mhm.
because you only get it if you're a cable subscriber. There was not streaming in most of these cases, so people couldn't stream the RSNs 5 years ago, even 3 years ago in many cases. And the teams did not want to give that business to the RSNs. They wanted to retain that for themselves. So you had this kind of overarching macroeconomic situation. And Fox sold FSN to Diamond Sports Holdings, which was partly owned by Sinclair, which is a broadcaster, a local broadcaster in many markets. They own things like the Tennis Channel, and they're known for sort of conservative politics.
Mhm.
Um, and so when they acquired the team, a number or the RSN, and which handled probably half the baseball teams, the MLB teams. There's more than one kind of network. NBC, Comcast had a bunch of teams, AT&T had a bunch of teams, but this was the big one. And at the time they acquired it, people said this deal is bad. They're overpaying. There's too much debt. With the revenue trends for RSNs, this thing is gonna tip over.
Like Sinclair was overpaying the teams
They had
for the
overpaid,
rights.
right? They were overpaying the teams, and because many of the deals were long-term deals, the teams would not usually reveal the kind of deal they had, but often they were 10-year, 5 to 10 year deals with these RSNs. And the
Mhm.
Twins, in their final deal, long-term deal with Bally's or Diamond, were supposedly getting $56 million a year. And to understand how sweet a deal this is, so the deal was largely based on cable penetration in
Mhm.
your area. So apparently the best deal in baseball is the LA Angels because the cable market in LA basically extends from Oceanside, California up to beyond Malibu and inland to San Bernardino. It's
Huge number of people.
millions and
Yeah.
millions of people. And so they apparently the Angels were getting so much money from cable it would roll your eyes. But the Twins were getting $56 million, and in exchange with for that 56 million, they also didn't have to sell the ads. Um, FanDuel sold the ads. They staffed the broadcasts, and the Twins got some piece of that. but they didn't have to pay for all these outside things.
Hmm.
So the Twins deal was up, unfortunately, during this recent period of turmoil, not this year, but last season or the season before.
So 2024, the deal ends.
Right.
Yeah.
They were in bankruptcy. Bally's was in bankruptcy. Diamond, sorry, and they were trying to come out of bankruptcy, and there was uncertainty about whether the Twins would get an offer from them. And the Twins finally decided, we're going to cut the cord with you guys. We're going to do it ourselves. And they took their broadcasts in house. Supposedly, they lost 50 some percent of the revenue just overnight,
So from about 50 to 25-ish.
something like that.
Okay.
And the Twins have to carry all the expense and staffing of executing the broadcasts. They're producing them, they're selling the ad time, they're paying the hosts and the broadcasters. And so it's a much less favorable and much more labor intensive deal for the teams. And so this is playing out on a broader scale this season because this is the first season the Diamond Sports Holdings RSNs have no business in baseball. Like I said, they're about to shut down.
Mhm.
And so they walked away from, I think, 8 or 10 MLB teams for this season. So they're now all going through what the Twins went through a year ago. And so the Twins are down 25 to $30 million in revenue from broadcasting. They were dealing with $25 million in debt service, let's say. And so we're talking about $50 to $60 million in expenses that they didn't have before 2020 on a team whose payroll was, needed to rise. And so the whole right sizing of the payroll thing, I'm jumping ahead a little bit,
Mhm.
but this very controversial thing that happened after the playoff run in 2023, where the team decided not to maintain the payroll and let a pitcher like Sonny Gray go in free agency, was what was happening behind the scenes is that the Twins were seeing all this revenue go away or paying all this debt service, and they couldn't make the books balance.
Mhm.
And so they're just like, we can't leave the payrolls. We've got to cut the payrolls because of all this loss of revenue and increase in debt service. And so that's kind of the economic situation, which has sort of brought the Twins to where they are.
So let's go a little bit back into 2023 because I think that's this sort of seminal moment for the fans and the franchise and the payroll and everything like that. So first, at the beginning of that year, the year before was when they signed Correa.
Yeah, I think so.
So out of nowhere, the team, has previously brought in Josh Donaldson as sort of a big dollar middle of the lineup bat. They dump him in a very weird way, and then days later, out of nowhere, sign former All Star World Series champion Carlos Correa for a considerable amount of money, and one that
30 some million a year, was it?
yeah, that felt very not Twins. We're never the ones who get to sign the Carlos Correas of the world, and all of a sudden, I think lots of fans say this is a whole new era, and it's coming off these years where we have a Josh Donaldson signing, and it feels like we are entering this different echelon as a franchise where we're not going to outspend the Yankees, but we might end up being middle of the pack. And hey, we just signed the biggest free agent of the offseason to a deal to come here and play. So Correa comes in, and then the 2023 season happens, and then I'll let you just jump in on 2023 and where things go from there.
Well, I mean, they had the playoff run. They won their first playoff series since 2002, was it?
Long time.
So it was over 2
Thanks
decades.
to Royce Lewis and some pitchers.
But they didn't get that far. They didn't fare. Who did they lose to?
The Astros.
Astros.
Yes.
There's certain teams they just get that always seem to.
Astros, just brutal.
And after the season ended, Joe Pohlad, because people were asking them, what's the payroll going to be next year? What are you going to spend? And it's so interesting too because you don't hear that in the NFL and you don't hear that in the NBA. It
Mhm.
really is a baseball thing. And at some point, he made a statement that they were going to need to right size the payroll to excuse me.
So this is 3 years into the debt. This is as the TV stuff is beginning to collapse, as attendance is sort of stagnant coming out of COVID and not ticking back up above 2 million people like it was before. There's
Right.
this moment of right sizing payroll. And just to go a little deeper into Twins lore, they had these two incredible pitchers all year, Pablo Lopez and Sonny Gray. And
Sonny
Sonny
Gray.
Gray's contract is up. And that is this this critical moment for the fan base where a bunch of this fissure
Right.
happens. So this.
And they didn't explain it to the public.
Mhm.
I think that's part of what Tom Pohlad seems to understand is that you can't say something like, "We're gonna right-size payroll,"
Mhm.
after a playoff run, the first playoff run in 21 seasons, and not explain it.
Right.
That the Twins perhaps had a reasonable rationale there. They're experiencing a huge erosion in broadcasting revenue, millions of dollars. They're saddled with this debt service, which is kind of peaking, and they have to spend it on that instead of players, or that was their choice at least. And so what the fans heard was the richest family in Minnesota or something like that telling the fans, "We're cutting payroll because we want to."
Mhm.
Not even a reason. And that goes back to kind of the Pohlad style, where they're private, they don't say much more than they need to publicly. And Tom recognizes that just from a transparency standpoint, that was a mistake. I
Yeah.
think he also recognizes that it was a mistake to cut payroll then, that it's just it sent a message to fans that they didn't care about winning.
Mhm.
That the team was like, okay, we gave you guys a little piece of candy and now we're gonna go back to losing for 3 years.
Right.
And so it's he recognizes that. But that was really, I think, as you've pointed out and as many have, that moment was what really sort of in recent history soured fans on the Twins. And the Pullets, there have been moments like that over the decades, right? It seems like there's like one thing a decade or one thing every 20 years. There's some sort of either brinksmanship or failure to invest that is perceived by the fans as kind of a betrayal. And depending on how old you are and how long you've been observing the Twins, there is really kind of a stack of them now.
Mhm. Right, right. And it also felt like, looking at it from the outside, there were some things that really felt like the management of the team, the general manager, had to it was not part of this long-term plan. They were doing things like paying Christian Vasquez a bunch of money to come be the backup catcher,
Right,
right?
right.
And you're going to pay Buxton and Correa a ton of money to come in. And if you know that your payroll's going to drop, you maybe don't do some of those things, or you do them differently, because it felt like all of a sudden our resources became very misallocated really quickly. And, looking from the outside, it seemed as if there was sort of a hope that attendance or the TV situation would get dramatically better, and that when they didn't, it was like, oh, we're now behind the eight ball and we got to kind of catch up.
I got the sense the way the Twins were operating is everything went back to square one in the off season.
Hmm.
And rather than maybe setting a 3-year payroll plan
Right.
that Derek Falvey and Thad Levine could work off of, it was just done 1 year at a time. And I understand, their revenues shift from year to year, fan attendance shifts. Um, but I think they were sort of making it up as they went along, and so they'd make a large investment and then not follow up on that investment the next season, and it would look sort of strange because, like,
Hmm.
well, you've done this and this, so let put the final pieces in place, but instead they're cutting back. So I think that was more of the to me the one of the sort of puzzlements was just the way they were sort of executing a long-term plan or not having a
Hmm.
long-term plan.
Right. Right. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that four teams last year in the MLB with smaller payrolls than the Twins indeed did make the playoffs. So there's a piece of this that tends to get put into payroll should be higher, payroll should be higher, payroll should be higher, um, but also needs to go into the it does not seem like the general manager and maybe the manager were managing the payroll that they had as effectively as they could. And that team was kept on until this last offseason, and the Brewers, for example, have a pretty similar payroll to the Twins. We've now dropped below them. But the last couple of years they have, and they've been much more successful with that payroll. So there is an element of the actual management of the team day to day that goes beyond payroll that has fallen short. Not to mention the fact a number of different promising prospects have come up, and just we can't seem to develop a lot of these younger bats in particular. So.
Yeah, and that's kind of mysterious. Now, I would say, in fairness to Derek Falvey, he was brought in the off season, the 2016-17 off season, and he took over for Terry Ryan, who was running basically a 1980s organization,
Right.
um, staffing wise, in metrics, data, training. Just the organization was old school, and so the Falvey regime hired dozens of people, modernized the Twins organization in many different respects, from their use of technology to how their minor leagues are managed, um, player training and food and all sorts of things. They established these academies in the Dominican Republic and a whole campus in Florida, for young players, and they did a lot of things to kind of bring the organization up to modernity. And I think they did that effectively, and he deserves credit for that. I think what they didn't really figure out was kind of how to turn that into creating a mix of players that could win the division and win in the playoffs, like the Brewers have
Hmm.
and other teams. And, he had a decade in that role. And it probably was time to move on to somebody else who might have a slightly different vision or a different approach. Because, like you say, they're drafting very good players. The Twins, throughout the last decade, have been ranked very highly in the analysis of kind of minor league systems and rankings of those things. But they don't develop the highly touted players. They're sort of, everybody in baseball is sort of like scratching their head, why didn't this work?
Right.
And so that is a mystery, and I don't know that I even understand why they've failed to sort of convert a bunch of promising young players to promising major league players.
Yeah. It's a bit baffling, but it will be different with Walker Jenkins and Kalen
But
Culpepper, I'm sure.
I do
Um,
think the money thing is salient, though, in this sense. I mean, if you look at the last couple seasons in Major League Baseball, and you look at the estimated um, team spending on payrolls and which teams got into the playoffs, it's fascinating because there's a lot of teams in the middle that didn't make the playoffs.
mhm.
And there's a surprising number of teams at the bottom that made the playoffs: the Brewers, the Cleveland, the
Mhm.
Guardians. I'm trying to think of the others,
Rays, the Tigers
the
had a low payroll
Rays.
last year.
The A's often end up in the playoffs
Right.
too, not last season,
Mhm.
but what you see happening is, by the time you get to the league championships and the World Series, the lower payroll teams tend to drop out.
Right.
They lose in the first or second round,
Mhm.
and then it is only, like, I believe last year the baseball's final four were all teams in the top 5 of payroll.
Right.
And so the people who look at this stuff, the experts, say that spending is the ultimate determinant.
Mhm.
And so then the problem the Twins have is, but it's what are you going to spend? Because you can't keep up with well, you could, but the Dodgers and the
Right.
Mets and all those teams, and so that's why Major League Baseball is trying to kind of reform its economics, because otherwise just going to have teams like the Twins that are just like always going to be in this situation
Yeah.
unless they spend $100 million more a year.
Right. Right, right. So, I want to do a little 2024 hits. We don't resign Sonny Gray. A bunch of people's performances drop off. There are a bunch of injuries. Team has a really disappointing season. Attendance drops. Fan anger gets a little higher. 2025, they're sort of in the midst of another disappointing season. Despite rattling off, they had a huge win streak. I think 10, 15 games, something like that last
Right
year.
after a huge losing streak, though, I think.
Right, right. And then, it kind of seems like they're going to make it, and they just are limping into the trade deadline. And then there is this trade deadline that I think, the other day we were looking at, The Athletic did a survey about how many fans are optimistic about the season, and Twins is at 4.3%. I think a lot of that comes out of what happens at the 2025 deadline. So, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that and where that has left the payroll and the fan base headed into this offseason where they make this ownership change?
Yeah, well, they traded away basically all their relief pitchers. Um,
Hometown Louis Varland
j-
too, which just
was a
felt like
head
it kicked the
scratch.
hornet's nest.
And I mean, they got Taj Bradley, who's so far been quite effective.
Mhm.
For was it who did they trade
Griffin
down? Griffin
Jacks.
Jacks.
Hmm.
And so and I talked to somebody who had talked to Derek Falvey after all those trades were made, and basically the rationale was this team could not pull it together. For whatever reason, this mix of players did not, they'd given them 2 seasons and they were just not getting over the hump. And Falvey believed that he could get minor leaguers for these relievers that were really promising and that would be up to the in the majors either this year 25 or 26 or next year 27. And he saw it as just kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit because the present wasn't working. And I would say that anybody who watched last year's team with any consistency would agree that it wasn't working.
Yeah.
Um, but then in the offseason, what changed is the Twins had to execute this transaction to bring in investors and pay it down the debt. I don't know if they paid all the debt off, but they paid it down. And that forced this reassessment internally, either at the behest of the investors, one of whom is Wild owner Craig Leopold,
Mhm.
um, but it forced this reassessment and this change in leadership. The Twins, I think this was all connected to the original decision to sell, but at the beginning of last season, Falvey was named president of the team, period. Not president of baseball operations, but president of the entire team. So he took over business operations. I think that had not been the plan for the entirety of his tenure, but at a certain point, when the Twins started thinking they were going to sell the team, the Pohlad started thinking, they decided that Joe was not going to be president or couldn't be president. There are those in the organization who say it was never the plan, but I know a number of people who believe it was.
Mhm.
Anyway, long story short, Falvey is running the team in its entirety. The decision is made to put Tom in charge of the organization, not Joe. So Joe is moved aside. Tom comes in. And I think Tom basically said, I can't really learn this organization if another person is running the business side.
Mhm.
I need to kind of be there or be at his side. And I think I wouldn't say there was a personality conflict. What I've heard is that they had very different styles. I think Derek was very deliberative, um, had a kind of a lot of process in how he did things, which maybe wasn't Tom's way. But they decided mutually, I guess, that it wasn't a good fit going forward. And so Derek left. Tom took on his responsibilities and that's what's brought us to where we are today. And I mean, it's very much a work in progress. And I think as far as what they're doing this season, I mean, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in Major League Baseball right now because there isn't a player contract for next year.
Right. And that's hanging over all this, right? Is
Right.
that everybody in the know seems to think that we're headed for a strike
Right.
of some
There's going to be a lockout in December when the contract expires because Major League Baseball doesn't want this to kind of drift and continue to pay players because you could conceivably negotiate for 2 years. And if they don't lock the players out, then the players have no incentive to come to a deal. Is the way they think about it. And so you do the lockout, but the problem is what the owners want this time around is not just tweaking the system. They want a wholesale rethinking of the system. They want a salary cap and floor. They want some form of sharing of broadcast revenues that will eventually allow baseball to have more control over broadcast revenues. It will be more centralized, whereas now it's all the individual teams.
the RSNs and all that. Yeah.
Right. One of the things that is interesting about Major League Baseball is more than the other sports, the teams very much operate as independent businesses.
Mhm.
They are less bound by kind of tentacles of financial control with Major League Baseball than the other sports are.
Right. Like a huge chunk of the Vikings revenue comes off of their national TV deal, a
Broadcast
much
contract.
much larger
Right.
percentage and amount than the Twins.
Totally, totally. And much more of how the broadcasting is handled is dictated by the league
Mhm.
than in Major League Baseball. And so Major League Baseball wants all these reforms. The players are, the viewpoint is a salary cap is not in the players' interest, or that's what the union has said. And so the assumption is there's going to be missed games,
Mhm.
that they will not have an agreement by February 15th to start spring training, and you'll end up with a shortened season. You might even end up with no season. Major League Baseball has missed. I don't know that they've ever missed a full season, but they've missed the bulk of a season before.
Right.
And so as far as the Twins go, and Tom Pohlad's sort of planning, and because of this transaction, and because the Twins didn't really start functioning on getting their roster together until about 2 months into the offseason,
Mhm.
the Twins ended up losing out on most of the free agents who got signed and most of the free agent relief pitchers. They literally, to me, this is a sort of a one of the more kind of bizarre indictments of the team is it just sort of sat on its hands for 2 months. Falvey couldn't sign players because he didn't have a payroll, and they were just all waiting for this transaction to wrap up.
Right.
And so, as a result, the Twins' current roster is basically what they could put together in the last, at the end, with the players who still happen to be on the market in the existing
I'd
roster.
never heard of half of the bullpen. I pay a lot of attention to these things.
Right. And so I think the question Tom Pohlad is asking now, though, is if there's not going to be a season next year, or if there's going to be an impaired season and the team is going to be out, lots of revenue, um, is this the right season to dramatically raise payroll and sort of go for broke?
Mhm.
Or is this a kind of a season of reconnoitering, him learning the business, trying to understand the dynamics that get fans into the ballpark and don't? And maybe if they're in the mix on July 15th, they'll make a trade or two, sign a player, bring in a player or two that might help them get into the playoffs, but that realistically speaking, they're probably looking at trying to make a push after the new contract is signed. And so you're talking about 28, um, depending on how next season goes, sometime in 27, and that this is likely going to be a year the Twins sort of keep their powder dry and don't really make a lot of big moves and keep the payroll low.
Interesting. So
Be-
your read is that they may be intentionally treading water this year, until the larger labor contract situation gets figured out.
Yeah, and I also think Tom Pohlad is trying to learn the business and trying to
Hmm.
understand, and I don't know that he wants to make dramatic moves or dramatic shifts in business model while he's still learning the business.
Interesting. So where do you think the Major League Baseball ends up on the other side of this? I mean, do you think that there will be a payroll? Do you think that there's something that they'll work out with some of the TV contracts, either nationally or locally? I mean, what is your prediction for where some of this stuff kind of lands on the other side?
I think the broadcasting thing is probably going to be easier to sort out than the player negotiations, just because Major League Baseball is sort of the victim of external dynamics,
Hmm.
or they're at the mercy of external dynamics. And so the demise of the RSN universe is something they can't avoid. They're having to deal with it. And so they are going to be moving towards more of a nationalized broadcast package. And it's really just going to require a few teams, the Cubs, the Yankees, the Mets, the Dodgers, the teams that own their own RSN
Hmm.
and who are not in economic distress, broadcast economic distress, um, to sign on to that. This is the ongoing problem with Major League Baseball, is that there are a handful of teams that make a lot of money and are very content with things the way they are. And so what the challenge for baseball is enticing the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Mets and the Cubs to change the system that's still working for them. The
Right.
system isn't working for the Twins. It's not really even working for the Brewers, but it is working for 5 or 6 or 7 teams. And Rob Manfred, the commissioner, has to get those teams on board to fix the broadcasting economics and to negotiate a player contract. But I think,
Despite it maybe not being all the way in their best interest.
right. And so I do think, though, right now, the mindset of the players is that they don't want a salary cap. It's interesting to me because, from how I understand Major League Baseball, there's a small handful of players. I don't know whether it's 25, 30, 40
Mhm.
that are making really large salaries whose earning power would be impaired under a salary cap. But 80% of a team's roster would either see more income or the same. And it would allow the disparities between in payrolls to to decrease. And so it's really just kind of the superstars of the game
Hmm.
whose earning power is going to be limited under this sort of a system. I mean, if you talk to Craig Leopold about at the NHL, he's quoted in this story as saying, within 2 years of us establishing a salary cap and floor, 80% of the teams were spending the maximum they could spend on salaries, and most every team was competitive, with the exception of a couple. And after 2 seasons, and so his point is that it's got much more upside than people believe, um, and so he thinks it's in baseball's interest. I think baseball's going to get there. It just seems like having teams like the Twins, whose fan base is disgruntled, and if you look at the asset value of these teams, the Twins are now worth the same as the Wild, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Hmm.
They play half as many games. Hockey is kind of a niche sport. Baseball, maybe it's not America's sport anymore, but it's still much more broadly known and played. The Twins should be worth a lot more. They have a favorable lease in a stadium, but the the nature of baseball's economics has kept the value of these teams depressed
Right.
because people don't want to pay premium prices for a team whose future economics are so uncertain.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with baseball. That's why the Wolves are worth $3 billion now, because the NBA's economics are very clear. The
Right.
trajectory is up, 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 and Adam Silver's just continued what's been there, and so that's why the Wolves are worth so much more than the Twins now.
Yeah. Really interesting. Um, so one of the sort of fan theories about where we may be headed is that when we're on the other side of the labor situation in the MLB, uh, there's been speculation about, will that be an opportunity where the team might sell or change hands? Were you able to get any sort of sense from Tom about whether you feel like that's in his plans or not in his plans?
I heard something similar um not long ago. I was talking to somebody who's close to the Twins who said, I would not be surprised once all the dust settles here and Major League Baseball has fixed its economic problems,
Mhm.
at which point the value of the team will rise substantially just because of the future prospects, that the family will sell the team. The Depending on who you listen to, the debt problems the team had were real, but I was also told that there was no longer consensus within the family about the value of owning the team.
Mm.
It's a very big asset. It's a 1.5 to $2 billion asset. It occupies a huge amount of the family wealth, the that asset. And as time passes, there are ever more and more Pohlads. It was just Carl and Eloise. Then it was Carl's three sons. They're now all in their 70s. And so now their kids, who are in their 40s by and large, and you have, I don't know the exact number, but it's gone from 1 to 3 to 9, 10, 12, something like that.
Mhm.
And not all of them have any stake in the Twins. Their family name is constantly trashed in public, in the media. Cheap Pohlads is a mantra. And from what I've heard, there were family members of Tom Pohlad's generation who felt that they didn't want to own the team anymore. They didn't like their little kids hearing that at school, their last name trashed at school. And they also maybe had economic ambitions that they couldn't carry out because so much of the family's wealth was tied up in the ball club.
Mhm.
Not a dissimilar situation from the Coles family at the time they sold the Star Tribune around 2000. It's just, you get the third generation, the wealth gets diffused, you've got a lot of different voices, and you can't find consensus. And so I was told that was part of the issue here, not just the debt. But what Tom insisted, I asked him this question very directly, and he insisted that they are in it for the long haul. They have no intention to sell the team. They are not. He specifically addressed this question of sitting on it until baseball reformed its economics, and he said that isn't our plan. Our plan is to continue to be long-term owners, and I believe they are the second or third longest termed owner in Major League Baseball right now already. I
Oh
think it's the
wow.
third. I think it's the Yankees are the longest termed in the Steinbrenner family. The ownership of the Phillies, I believe, is at least one of their owners has been involved in the team longer than the Pohlads, and then it's the Twins.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, anything else you'd like to share about the team situation or your conversation that you think could be helpful for people to know?
Man, I really think we've covered it. But I think that the thing that really has struck me right now, and I don't know how much of this is the poll ads and how much of this is just the team history, but we talked the other day about this survey that was done of hopefulness, fan
Hmm.
hopefulness, and the
Yep.
Twins were at the bottom, 4% hopeful.
Dead last.
Um, and I looked at the teams above them, the 29 teams above them, and there were teams with demonstrably worse owners. Owners who don't care, owners who are disreputable, all sorts of things, faceless corporations, and teams that had far weaker minor league systems than the Twins, probably poorer prospects this season for kind of one loss
Hmm.
record, whose fans were far more confident. And it really was I mean, it was, if I'm sure, Tom Pohlad said he saw that and it was dispiriting to him. And it was kind of fascinating because you ask yourself, why are Twins fans so angry and so hopeless? And I don't know the answer to that. I know that, we don't seem to like rich people in this country much anymore. And I often feel that there's a lot of animosity to the Pohlads because they've been successful. Um, but it is a dark time for baseball fans in this community, and I don't know how much of it is reality and how much of it is perception anymore. But people have really bad attitudes, and that, as the owner of a
Hmm.
product you're selling every day to the community, that's daunting. As a business goes, if I was someone just analyzing the prospects of that business, that is not a stat you want to see.
Yeah.
4% of the fans are invested in your product anymore.
It's not great. Not great. I think the only way out is they're just gonna have to win. They're gonna have to win baseball games, and I think when they do, the fans will come back. I don't know that this is going to be the year for that, but I think that's the only thing that's going to start to fix it is once there is a winner on the field, people will fill that stadium up again, and things will change. But when will that be? I don't
And I think
know.
that's what Tom Pohlad believes.
Hmm.
He has said, look, there's lots of economic externalities in Major League Baseball right now, but if we can win, it will solve most of our problems.
Yeah.
And so I think he very much views it the same way.
Well, I hope that he is successful, and I hope that we have some fun days out at Target Field this summer. You can check out more of Adam's conversation in our latest issue. A lot of other good stuff in there as well. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure anytime.